15 years Baekhyun spent building the most feared empire in Seoul, floor by floor, sacrifice by sacrifice, with hands that never once trembled and a mind that never once doubted. He was never wrong about a person until her. She was just a maid, quiet, still, a young woman with steady hands and eyes that saw too much. He barely noticed her. And then one night, he found documents he was certain proved her betrayal, and he exploded. He fired her in rage, his voice shaking the penthouse windows, the Seoul skyline burning cold behind him. She didn't beg, didn't explain, didn't break. She simply bowed and walked out into the rain. By morning, his world was coming apart at the foundation. Because the documents weren't about her betrayal. This is the story of Baekhyun, Seoul's coldest mafia boss, a man who built an empire on pride and called it strength. And Sia, the quiet, unshakable young woman who walked into his penthouse not for a paycheck, but for the truth about her mother's stolen legacy. She didn't come to fight him. She came to find proof. And she almost had it, right before he threw her out. But beneath the rage and the power and the scattered documents on that penthouse bed lies something neither of them expected. Two people. One buried betrayal. And a reckoning 15 years in the making. He fired her in fury. He will find her in truth. And the empire he thought he built alone was never really his to begin with. The documents hit the bed like a verdict. Baekhyun's voice was not loud. It never needed to be. It was the kind of voice that didn't raise itself because it had never needed to, a low, controlled blade of sound that cut cleaner than shouting ever could. But tonight, something different lived inside it. Something cracked and burning that even he couldn't contain. 6 months, he said, his jaw tight, his dark eyes fixed on the papers scattered across the white linen like evidence at a crime scene. 6 months in my home, in my space, going through things that were never yours to touch. He looked up. Sia stood on the opposite side of the bed, her hands clasped in front of her apron, her back straight. She was looking directly at him, not in defiance, not in fear, but with the steady, unreadable calm of someone standing in a storm they had long prepared for. Her natural hair was pulled back neatly. Her uniform was immaculate. Not a single thing about her suggested she was about to break. That stillness made him colder. Eye in the doorway, Woo Jin had gone completely rigid, his leather portfolio held against his chest like a shield, his eyes moving carefully between the two of them. Aunt Harin stood just behind him, one hand pressed to her mouth, her gray silk top trembling slightly with the breath she was holding. You were feeding information to the Kims. Baekhyun's voice dropped even lower. Everything you saw, everything you heard. You came into this house to spy, and you were good at it. I'll give you that. You were very, very good at looking like nothing. Sia said nothing. The silence stretched across the room like a wire pulled too tight. Get out. The words landed with a finality that sealed the air. Tonight. Now. You leave this building, and if I ever see your face again in anything connected to my name, you will deeply regret the day your aunt ever recommended you for this position. Still, she said nothing. She held his gaze for one long, steady moment, and in it, something passed across her expression that was not quite sadness and not quite pity, but something that sat precisely between the two. Then she reached down, smoothed the front of her apron once with both hands, and performed a deep, unhurried bow. Not the bow of a servant who had been defeated. The bow of a woman who had already won something he didn't yet understand. She turned and she walked out. Baekhyun stood in the blue-wash silence of his penthouse, the Seoul skyline blazing indifferently beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass, the scattered documents still lying across his bed. Harin finally exhaled, a small, fractured sound. Woo Jin still hadn't moved. Baekhyun looked down at the papers. For the first time in 15 years, his certainty felt like it weighed something. There was a version of Baekhyun that Seoul had long forgotten. He was 23 in that version. Thin in the way that hunger makes a person thin, not lean, not sharp, but hollowed out, like something essential had been quietly removed to keep the rest of him running. He slept on a folding mat in a single-room office in Maid, his only furniture a second-hand desk and a conviction so large it took up most of the available air. He had no connections. No family name worth mentioning. No one in the city who would have crossed the street to catch him if he fell. What he had was a plan. And the kind of rage that, in the right hands, becomes architecture. He spent 2 years building the skeleton of what would eventually become the Park Group, scraping together small logistics contracts, learning the language of money from the inside of rooms where he was never quite welcome, absorbing every lesson the city offered him about who held power and why. He was meticulous. He was relentless. And he was, despite everything, running out of time. Then the investment arrived at IT came through Sung-min, his advisor, his strategist, the one man who had attached himself to Baek Hyen's ambition early enough to understand its scale. The funding was substantial, transformative, the kind of capital that didn't just open doors but removed entire walls. Sung-min presented it cleanly, efficiently, with the smooth delivery of a man who had already decided what details mattered. Anonymous backers, he said. Institutional. No strings, Baek Hyen didn't ask questions. In those days, he couldn't afford the luxury of skepticism. He took the money, signed the papers Sung-min placed in front of him, and built. And he built, and he built, and he built. The Park Group rose over the following decade like something inevitable, floor by floor, sector by sector, until its shadow fell across half of Seoul's underground economy and a significant portion of its legitimate one. Baek Hyen's name became a currency of its own. The hungry young man from Mapo was replaced, gradually and then completely, by something colder and more permanent. A man who had learned that certainty was armor, that warmth was exposure, and that the only people who never got hurt were the ones who needed nothing from anyone. He was proud of what he had built. He had earned the right to be. What he didn't know, what Sung-min had ensured he would never know, was the name of the woman whose belief had made it possible. Dr. Seo Ji-yu died 3 years after the investment, in the private wing of a Seoul hospital, of what the death certificate called a cardiac event. She was 41. She had a daughter. She had, by all accounts, been waiting to be acknowledged as a partner in something she had helped create. No one from the Park Group attended her funeral, and no one from the Park Group had been told she existed. Sia was 7 years old the first time she understood that something had been taken. She didn't have the language for it then. She only had the image, her mother at the kitchen table late at night, surrounded by folders and reading glasses and the particular silence of a woman carrying something too heavy to put down. Ji-yu would look up when she heard Sia's small footsteps, and she would smile, warm, immediate, the kind of smile that made a child feel like the most important thing in any room. But even at 7, Sia could see what lived behind it. A tiredness that sleep didn't touch. A grief with no grave to stand over. Ji-yu never spoke bitterly about it. That was the thing Sia would turn over for years afterward, her mother's extraordinary absence of bitterness. She spoke about the Park Group the way you speak about a fire that burned your house down while you were still inside it, with a kind of exhausted, factual clarity. She had believed in a young man. She had invested everything. She had been erased so thoroughly that her own name no longer appeared in any document connected to the organization she had helped breathe into existence. She died still waiting for acknowledgement that never came. Sia spent the years after her mother's death doing what Ji-yu had been too graceful to do. She hired lawyers. She filed requests. She followed paper trails through 3 different jurisdictions and hit the same wall every time, clean, seamless, and clearly intentional. Whatever Sung-min had done to bury the Seo Foundation's involvement, he had done it with the precision of someone who had anticipated every conventional avenue of investigation. So Sia chose an unconventional one. It took her 4 months to get the position. She built the credentials carefully, applied through the correct channels, and presented herself as exactly what she appeared to be, competent, quiet, and unremarkable. She understood that invisibility in the right environment was its own form of access. For 6 months inside the Park Group penthouse, she watched and listened and waited. She learned Baek Hyen's rhythms, his habits, the specific geography of his trust. She cataloged discarded documents, memorized names overheard in passing, and pieced together the architecture of a cover-up that was older than she fully realized. She had found the CO Foundation's original transfer records. She had found the amendment that rerouted her mother's equity. She needed one more piece, the signature that connected Sung-min directly to Ji-Yu's erasure. She had been 3 days away from finding it. And then Baek Hyen had found something first. Now she sat at the small table in her modest apartment, the documents spread carefully before her, her hands steady in the way they had trained themselves to be. The city hummed distantly beyond the window. She looked down at the photograph beside the papers. Her mother, young and bright-eyed and smiling, standing in front of a building she had helped build and never been allowed to enter. Sia placed her hand gently over the image. She was not finished. The penthouse had always been quiet. Baek Hyen had built it that way deliberately. The thick walls, the acoustic glass, the absence of anything decorative that might also be noisy. Silence was a tool he had learned to wield the way other men wielded conversation. It kept people uncomfortable. It kept him sharp. But the silence the morning after the firing was a different thing entirely. He noticed it first at his desk. He was reviewing a logistics report that would normally have held his attention without effort, the columns of numbers arranging themselves into meaning the way they always did. But his eyes kept moving to the edge of the page and stopping there, as though waiting for something that wasn't coming. The coffee at his elbow had gone cold. He hadn't touched it. Normally, it would have been refreshed twice by now, quietly, efficiently, without interruption. He told himself it meant nothing. Sung-min arrived mid-morning with the smoothness of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. He refilled the schedule, redistributed the household tasks, and stood at the corner of Baek Hyen's desk with his tablet and his measured suggestions and his calm, attentive smile. He was thorough. He was efficient. He filled every visible gap with a precision that should have been reassuring. Baek Hyen watched him and felt, for a reason he couldn't locate, faintly irritated. He said nothing. He signed the papers Sung-min placed before him and returned his eyes to the report. Harin came in the late afternoon, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the way she sat, not across from him in her customary upright, purposeful posture, but sideways in the chair, her hands folded in her lap, watching him with the patient, sorrowful attention of a woman who had seen a particular kind of damage before and recognized its early signs. She didn't say anything about Sia directly. Harin was too careful for that. She asked about his lunch, about an upcoming family obligation, about whether he was sleeping. He answered each question with a brevity that was meant to close the conversation. She stayed anyway. 3 floors below, in the building's administrative annex, Woo Jin sat alone at a long table with a stack of folders he had requested through internal channels using language careful enough not to attract attention. His face was neutral. His movements were unhurried. But his eyes, moving steadily across the documents, had the focused quality of a man who had stopped looking for something general and started looking for something specific. He had been present in that room the night of the firing. He had seen the documents on the bed before Baek Hyen had seized them. And one of the numbers on a transfer record, visible for only a moment before the papers were scattered, had matched something he had seen years ago and quietly filed away in the part of his memory reserved for things that didn't yet make sense. It was beginning to make sense now. Upstairs, Baek Hyen stood at the floor-to-ceiling window as the city darkened below him, his reflection ghosted in the glass. The penthouse was immaculate. Everything was in its place. Sung-min had seen to that. And yet something was profoundly, undeniably missing. And the fact that he couldn't name it was the most unsettling thing of all. Woo Jin came to him on a Thursday evening, which was deliberate. Sung-min kept Thursdays light on the schedule, a pattern Woo Jin had observed over several years and never mentioned to anyone until now. He closed the study door behind him without being asked. He set the folder on the desk in front of Baek-hyun without preamble or softening. And then he sat down, folded his hands, and said simply, "You need to read all of it. Not the summary. All of it." Baek-hyun looked at him for a moment, reading, as he always did, the space around the words rather than the words themselves. What he found in Woo Jin's expression was not nervousness. It was the specific gravity of a man who had already made peace with the consequences of what he was about to do. He opened the folder. The first document was a 15-year-old incorporation record for the CO Foundation, a private investment entity registered quietly in a name he didn't recognize. The second was a funding agreement. The numbers were familiar. The terms were familiar. The date was the exact date Sung-min had brought him the anonymous investment that changed everything. He turned the page. The third document was a shareholder register. At the top, in clean printed type, was a name, Dr. Co. Jiu, 40% equity stake, original founding backer of the Park Group. Baek-hyun did not move. He read the name again, and again. The way you reread a sentence when the meaning refuses to assemble itself into something your mind will accept. He kept turning pages. Woo Jin had organized them chronologically, and the story they told was methodical and complete. Jiu's stake, intact for 3 years. Then her death, the cardiac event, the hospital record. Then a series of internal amendments, each one small enough to appear routine, each one moving fractional percentages of her equity into a numbered holding structure that dissolved, eventually, into the Park Group's general ownership pool. The amendments were signed off by the company's legal advisor. Every signature was Sung-min's. Baek-hyun reached the last page and stopped. The study was very quiet. Outside, Seoul continued its indifferent motion. The lights, the traffic, the vast machinery of a city that owed no one stillness. Inside, the most powerful man in the room sat without speaking for a long time. This was not the silence he used as a weapon. This was something else. This was the silence of a man standing in the ruins of a story he had told himself so many times it had become the only story he knew how to live inside. For 15 years he had believed one thing about himself above all others, that what he had built alone. That the empire was entirely his. That no debt existed that he hadn't already paid in full with his own sacrifice. He set the last page down with a care that was almost gentle. He had been wrong. Not about a deal. Not about a rival. About the entire foundation of everything he was. He didn't look at Woo Jin. He looked at the folder, at Jiu's name on the shareholder register, and he stayed very still with the specific, terrible weight of a man whose identity had just been quietly, irrevocably taken apart. "Where is her daughter now?" he said finally. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man already beginning to move. Sung-min had always known this day was a possibility. He had simply planned for it the way he planned for everything, quietly, thoroughly, and long before anyone else in the room understood there was anything to plan for. The difference between him and the men who got caught was not intelligence. It was patience. And patience, in 15 years of careful architecture, had served him extraordinarily well. He knew about Woo Jin's file requests by Wednesday. His contact in the administrative annex had flagged the access log with the same efficiency Sung-min paid him to maintain. He reviewed the list of pulled documents in the back of his car on the way to a dinner he attended with his customary composure, and by the time the first course arrived, he had already made 3 decisions. The first was that Wu Jin was no longer an asset. The second was that the remaining CO Foundation documents, the 2 physical files he had not been able to digitally erase because they were stored in a legal archive under a partner firm's records, needed to disappear before the end of the week. The third was Xia. He met with the Kims in a private room above a restaurant in Apgujeong, a location they had used before, chosen for its noise and its complete absence of cameras in the corridor leading to the stairs. The 2 men across from him were not friends. They were instruments, which was the only category of person Sungmin had ever found genuinely reliable. He explained what he needed with the clean economy of someone placing a business order. No excess language. No visible emotion. Xia was a loose thread. Loose threads, left uncut, became the thing that unraveled everything. The men across the table nodded. A figure was agreed upon. Sungmin finished his tea, replaced the cup with the precision of a man who had never once spilled anything in his life, and left. Xia was at her table when the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, not in her contacts, not in any pattern she recognized. She almost didn't answer. Then something in the specific rhythm of her own instincts, sharpened by 6 months of careful survival inside a penthouse full of dangerous men, made her pick up. The voice was Wu Jin's, stripped down low and moving fast. Don't go home tonight. Don't go anywhere connected to your name. Sungmin knows you were pulling documents, and he knows what you have. You have maybe a few hours. A pause, brief, waited. He's already made calls. The line went quiet. Xia sat completely still for 3 seconds. Then she stood, moved to the table, and began gathering the documents with the focused efficiency of someone who had mentally rehearsed this moment without ever fully believing it would arrive. She took the papers. She took the folder. Last, she took the photograph of her mother, carefully, deliberately, tucking it against her chest as she moved toward the door. The city outside was loud and indifferent. She stepped into it anyway. Baek Hyen had not walked anywhere alone in 11 years. There were always men positioned ahead, positioned behind, a perimeter so habitual it had long since stopped feeling like protection and started feeling like atmosphere. He moved through Seoul the way heads of state moved through airports. Efficiently, invisibly, and never without a layer of insulation between himself and the uncontrolled world. He left them all in the penthouse. Wu Jin had given him an address, a neighborhood in Mapo, which landed with a quiet irony Baek Hyen didn't have time to examine. He took the private elevator to the basement, walked past the row of waiting vehicles and their waiting drivers, and stepped out into the rain-soaked street like a man who had simply decided that this particular thing he needed to do himself. The rain was steady and indifferent. He had no umbrella. He didn't go back for one. He moved through the city with his collar turned up and his hands in his pockets, and Seoul, for its part, paid him very little attention. Without the architecture of his usual presence, the men, the cars, the gravitational field of his own authority, he was simply a well-dressed man walking quickly through the wet. It was a strangely exposed feeling. Not dangerous, just unfamiliar. The way honesty feels unfamiliar when you have spent years finding it unnecessary. He had no speech prepared. He was aware of this in the specific, uncomfortable way you become aware of something you've always outsourced and suddenly cannot. He had spent 15 years in rooms where he held every advantage, information, leverage, the upper hand so firmly established that conversation was merely a formality. He didn't know the language of arriving at someone's door carrying nothing but a debt and an acknowledgement of fault. He didn't know how to begin. He was 3 blocks from the address when his phone showed a message from Woojin. 2 words. Move faster. Baek Hyeon moved faster. He turned the last corner at something close to a run, which was also something he had not done in 11 years, and came to the building just as Sia emerged from the entrance, her bag against her body, her head down, moving with the focused urgency of someone who already knew the walls were closing in. She looked up and stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved. The rain fell between them in a steady curtain. She was looking at him the way she had looked at him across the penthouse bed, direct, composed, unreadable, except that now, underneath the steadiness, he could see something else, not fear, something more carefully contained than fear. He opened his mouth. Nothing came. 11 years of commanding rooms, of reducing seasoned men to silence with a single measured sentence, and he was standing in the rain in Mapo with no words at all. Just the weight of a folder full of documents in his jacket and the unfamiliar, specific heaviness of a man who had come to return something that could never fully be given back. "I know," he finally said. It was not enough. He knew it wasn't enough. But it was the first true thing he had said in 15 years, and it cost him more than she would ever know. He brought her to the Park Group Tower because it was the safest building in Seoul, and because, on some level he didn't fully articulate even to himself, it was the right place for this conversation. They took the private elevator to the rooftop. 42 floors. Neither of them spoke during the ascent. The roof was wide and open, ringed by the glittering sprawl of Seoul in every direction, a city that looked, from this height, like something deliberately beautiful. The rain had softened to a mist. Baek Hyeon stood with his back to the skyline and told her everything Woojin had found. He spoke with the same economy he brought to boardrooms, but without the armor. Just the facts, laid out in order, with nothing withheld. The CO Foundation, the equity stake, the amendments after Ji-Yu's death, Sungmin's signatures on every page. Sia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she opened her bag and told him what she had found from the inside. The transfer records she had photographed. The internal memos she had pieced together over 6 months of careful, invisible work. The signature she had been 3 days away from locating on the night he fired her. The one that proved Sungmin hadn't just rerouted the shares, but had falsified the medical consultation that preceded her mother's death. The air between them was not warm. It was the careful, painful temperature of 2 people conducting a transaction in a currency neither of them had chosen. He had taken something from her without knowing it. That absence of intention did not make it smaller. She did not offer him the comfort of absolution, and he did not ask for it. "I'm not forgiving you tonight," she said. Her voice was even. "I want you to understand that clearly." "I know," he said. For the second time that night, it was the only honest answer he had. She nodded once, not in warmth, but in the acknowledgement of a woman who respected precision. Then the rooftop door opened. 3 men came through it with the practiced efficiency of people who had been given clear instructions and intended to carry them out without complication. Baek Hyeon recognized the build, the positioning, the particular blankness of hired purpose. He stepped in front of Sia before he had consciously decided to, not as a calculation, not as strategy, simply as a man placing himself between a woman and the consequences of his own 15 years of blindness, because it was the only immediate thing he could actually do. What followed was brief and decisive and left him with a cut above his left eye and a deep ache in his ribs that he wouldn't acknowledge for several days. When Woo Jin arrived with the authorities 12 minutes later, Sungmin was already in custody at the building's entrance. Apprehended mid-departure, his composure finally, visibly cracked. Sia stood at the rooftop railing, looking out over the city her mother had helped build. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The legal process took 11 days. Woo Jin managed it with the quiet, meticulous efficiency of a man who had been waiting years for the opportunity to do something that mattered. The SEO Foundation's original documentation, combined with Sia's 6 months of careful interior work, constructed a case that was difficult to dispute and impossible to bury. Sungmin's lawyers attempted both. They failed at both. The falsified medical records alone ensured that what began as a civil claim expanded into something considerably more serious. Sungmin faced prosecution on 4 counts. He received the news, by all accounts, with the same composed expression he had maintained for 15 years, right up until the moment he didn't. Woo Jin was formally reinstated with an expanded mandate. He accepted it without ceremony, which was the only way Baek Hyun knew how to offer things, and, it turned out, the only way Woo Jin knew how to receive them. Sia's legal claim was formalized on a Tuesday morning in a document that Baek Hyun signed without hesitation and without being asked twice. Ji-Yu's name was restored to the Park Group's founding records, not as a current stakeholder, not as a silent partner, but as the original backer. Acknowledged. Permanent. Printed in the same clean type as every other foundational truth the company had been built upon. A matter of public record from that day forward. It was a small thing measured against what had been taken. Baek Hyun understood this and did not pretend otherwise. He was alone in the penthouse the evening after the documents were filed. The study felt different with Sungmin's presence removed from it, larger, somehow, and very still. Baek Hyun had not replaced the desk in the corner where his advisor had worked for 15 years. He had cleared it instead and placed a single framed photograph at its center. Ji-Yu, young and bright-eyed, standing in front of a building she had helped make possible. Smiling with the uncomplicated warmth of someone who still believed the world would eventually be fair. He looked at it for a long time. Sia was not in the penthouse. She had not been back since the rooftop, and he had not asked her to come. Some debts don't resolve themselves in the space of 11 days, and he was, for the first time in his life, willing to sit with that uncertainty rather than force a conclusion. He moved to the window. Seoul spread itself below him in every direction. The lights, the motion, the vast indifferent beauty of a city that had watched him build something and never once told him the whole story. For 15 years he had stood at this window absolutely certain of what he owned. Tonight he stood here knowing that certainty had been a construction, that the foundation had other names on it, that the man he had believed himself to be was both less and more than he had understood. The uncertainty felt, strangely, like the first honest breath he had taken in a very long time. Then a knock at the door. He didn't know who it was. He had no information, no advantage, no answer prepared in advance. Just the knock, and the door, and the unfamiliar, quietly terrifying openness of a man who had finally stopped needing to know everything before he was willing to begin. He turned from the window. He walked to the door. He opened it. The moral lesson. The story carries one central truth, delivered quietly but with devastating weight. Pride that refuses to be corrected doesn't protect you. It blinds you, and what you can't see will eventually own you. Baek Hyun spent 15 years building an empire on a foundation he never thought to examine, trusting a man he never thought to question, and dismissing a woman he never thought to truly see. His greatest weapon, his absolute, unshakable certainty, was also the precise tool his enemies used against him. He wasn't defeated by a rival organization or a superior force. He was nearly destroyed by his own refusal to be wrong. Sia, by contrast, carried her truth for years without bitterness and without shortcuts. She chose patience over rage, proximity over confrontation, and quiet evidence over loud accusation. In a world that rewards power and noise, she won with stillness and precision. The story ultimately asks a question every person in a position of authority must answer sooner or later. What is the cost of never admitting you are wrong? And it answers it simply. Everything. The moment that Cain opened that door, without certainty, without preparation, without knowing the answer in advance, was the moment he became, for the first time, truly powerful.